In 1935, New York City was home to 7 million people, and it was doing two things at once that should have been impossible. It was falling apart and being rebuilt, at the same time, by the same people, often on the same block. This was the Great Depression at its most contradictory, and nowhere was that contradiction more visible than here. Half the city's manufacturing plants had closed. Nearly 1 million New Yorkers were out of work. Families who had been middle class 3 years earlier were lining up for bread on the Lower East Side, some of them getting dressed in their best clothes before they left the house, so the neighbors wouldn't know where they were really going. And yet, bridges were going up, tunnels were being bored under rivers. A mayor named Fiorello LaGuardia, who stood barely 5 feet tall, was smashing slot machines with a sledgehammer in front of news cameras. A photographer was being paid by the federal government to take pictures of buildings that wouldn't exist by the time her film was developed. And a 16-year-old kid stealing a 10-cent penknife from a store on 125th Street was about to spark the first modern race riot in American history. This is what New York was really like in 1935. Not just the breadlines, not just the skyscrapers, the whole tangled, contradictory, furious, beautiful thing. To understand what daily life actually felt like, you have to start with the numbers, because the numbers in 1935 are almost impossible to believe. The average hourly wage was about 50 cents. If you were lucky enough to have a full-time job, you might bring home $15 to $20 a week. A loaf of bread cost 8 cents, a pound of steak cost 21 cents, milk was 47 cents a gallon, a pack of cigarettes ran you 14 cents. A room at the Waldorf Astoria, one of the most luxurious hotels in the world, went for $5 to $7 a night. Those prices sound dreamlike from where we sit now, but here's the thing people forget. Wages were just as low, and for the 1 in 5 New Yorkers who had no wages at all, even 8 cents for a loaf of bread might as well have been $8. Breadlines and soup kitchens served as many as 85,000 meals a day across the city. Over 50,000 people were sleeping on the streets or in makeshift shelters by the waterfront. There were 82 breadlines in Manhattan alone, and the shame of it was sometimes worse than the hunger. People would leave their apartments in a pressed suit, a polished hat, as if they were heading to the office. They'd walk blocks out of their way to reach a soup kitchen in a neighborhood where nobody knew them. They'd eat quickly, not making eye contact, and then walk home the long way around. The Depression didn't just empty wallets. It hollowed people out from the inside. Now hold that image in your mind. A man in a clean fedora and threadbare coat, walking 12 blocks to eat watered-down soup out of a tin cup, and then look up. Because above him, the skyline was being rewritten. The Empire State Building had gone up just 4 years earlier. The Chrysler Building, with its gleaming Art Deco crown, was already a landmark. Rockefeller Center was open for business. Radio City Music Hall, with its 6,000-seat auditorium, was pulling in crowds every night. And across the boroughs, the physical city was being reshaped by two men who could not have been more different in temperament or method, but who between them were remaking New York from the ground up. The first was Fiorello LaGuardia. He'd been elected mayor in 1933 on a reform platform dedicated to one thing: destroying Tammany Hall, the corrupt democratic machine that had run New York for decades. LaGuardia was the first Italian-American mayor of the city, and he governed the way he spoke, loud, fast, and with his whole body. New York's governor at the time, Herbert Lehman, had backed the New Deal programs flowing into the city, but it was LaGuardia who made the most noise about how that money got spent. In 1934, his first full year in office, he had slot machines dragged out of bars and candy stores across the city, over 1,200 of them. He smashed them with a sledgehammer in front of reporters, loaded the wreckage onto a barge, and dumped the whole pile into Long Island Sound. Those slot machines belonged to Frank Costello, one of the most powerful mafia bosses in America. LaGuardia looked into the newsreel camera and said, "Let the gamblers, the tin horns, the racketeers, and the gangsters take notice. They have to keep away from New York from now on." But LaGuardia wasn't just fighting the mob over gambling. He was fighting them over vegetables. This is one of those stories that sounds like it can't possibly be true, but every word of it is documented. By 1935, The Morello crime family had quietly cornered the national market for baby artichokes, a staple in Italian-American kitchens across the city. Their boss, Ciro Terranova, known as the Artichoke King, had sent enforcers to California to intimidate growers into selling their entire crop to the mob at artificially low prices. Terranova's men then resold the artichokes to New York vendors at a 30 to 40% markup. Anyone who refused to cooperate was beaten. The racket was pulling in over $300,000 a year, the equivalent of more than $6 million today. On December 21, 1935, at 10 minutes to 7 in the morning, LaGuardia showed up at the Bronx Terminal Market with a dozen police officers and a pair of trumpeters. He climbed onto the back of a flatbed truck, unrolled a scroll, and declared a citywide ban on the sale, display, or possession of artichokes. He told the assembled vendors, "I know you are honest men, and as long as I am mayor, no racketeer, thug, or punk is going to intimidate you." The New York Herald Tribune ran a headline the next day, noting it was impossible not to conclude the world was a bit mad. The ban lasted less than a week. Prices dropped. The racket collapsed. Terranova, already weakened by infighting within his own crime family, was effectively finished. He died 3 years later, the only one of 4 Terranova brothers to die in bed, and LaGuardia admitted publicly that he personally loved artichokes. That story captures something essential about 1935 New York. The Depression hadn't just impoverished people, it had given organized crime a stranglehold on the most basic elements of daily life. The mob wasn't operating in some shadow world, it was standing between families and their groceries, and it took a 5'2" mayor standing on the back of a vegetable truck at dawn to break the grip. But LaGuardia was only half the story of the city's physical transformation. The other half was Robert Moses. Moses had been appointed Parks Commissioner in 1934, and he operated on a scale that still defies comprehension. Using a labor force of 70,000 workers funded by New Deal money, federal dollars flowing through Roosevelt's Works Progress Administration, Moses launched a building campaign that would eventually produce hundreds of playgrounds, 11 massive public swimming pools, miles of new beaches, the Triborough Bridge connecting Manhattan, Queens, and the Bronx, and parkway systems that reshaped the entire metropolitan region. In the span of just a few years, he took the number of playgrounds in New York from 119 to nearly 800. He built 3 zoos. He expanded park acreage from 14,000 to nearly 35,000 acres. He built things faster than any city official in American history, before or since. But there's a darker thread woven through this building spree, and you can't tell the story of 1935 New York honestly without pulling on it. Of the 255 playgrounds Moses built in the 1930s, according to Robert Caro's landmark biography The Power Broker, published in 1974 and awarded the Pulitzer Prize, only 1 or 2 were placed in predominantly black neighborhoods. The pools, the parks, the beaches, nearly all of them were built in white communities or positioned to be functionally inaccessible to black and Hispanic New Yorkers. According to Caro, the one pool Moses did build near a black neighborhood in Harlem was kept at a deliberately freezing temperature because Moses believed black people did not like cold water. The city was being built. But it was not being built for everyone, and on March 19, 1935, that fault line cracked open on 125th Street. At 2:30 in the afternoon, a 16-year-old boy named Lino Rivera, black, Puerto Rican, from the neighborhood, was caught shoplifting a 10-cent penknife from the Crest 5 and 10 store right across the street from the Apollo Theater. An employee grabbed him. Rivera bit the man's hand. The store manager called the police. A patrolman arrived, and to avoid the growing crowd at the front entrance, he escorted Rivera out through the basement to a rear door, where the boy was released. But the crowd never saw him leave. A woman shouted that the boy was being dragged to the basement to be beaten. An ambulance arrived, called for the employee with the bitten hand, but it left empty, and to the crowd outside, that empty ambulance looked like confirmation that Lino Rivera was dead. He wasn't dead. He was home by dinner time. But the rumor had already caught fire. By 5:30, the store had closed, and the crowd had spilled into the streets. Speakers tried to hold a public meeting, but police arrested 2 of them for unlawful assembly. By nightfall, thousands of Harlem residents were in the streets. Windows shattered, Stores were looted, mostly white-owned businesses. The riot burned through the night. By morning, 3 people were dead, all of them black. Hundreds were injured. Over 100 were arrested. Property damage ran to $2 million. Historians call it the first modern race riot in American history. Modern because it was directed primarily at property rather than at people, and because its causes were not a single incident but a system. The Harlem community in 1935 was locked out of more than 24 of the city's trade unions. Black workers were routinely the first fired and last hired. Housing discrimination was open and unchallenged. Police aggression was constant. LaGuardia, to his credit, appointed a multiracial commission to investigate the conditions that had led to the uprising. The commission spent a year conducting hearings that the black press followed closely. Their final report, delivered in March of 1936, laid the blame squarely on discrimination in employment, police brutality, and racial segregation. And then LaGuardia buried it. He refused to let the city publish the commission's findings. The report only reached the public because the Amsterdam News, Harlem's leading black newspaper, printed it on its own. The mayor, who had smashed slot machines on camera, who had banned artichokes at dawn with trumpets blazing, could not bring himself to release a document that told the truth about what was happening 10 blocks north of his own office. That contradiction, the willingness to fight corruption in the market but not injustice in the neighborhood, is the contradiction at the heart of 1935 New York. It is the contradiction the city was built on, and there was one person that year who saw it all clearly. In 1935, a photographer named Berenice Abbott received a salary of $145 a month from the Federal Art Project, part of the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, along with a car, a field assistant, and a research team. Her assignment was to photograph New York City. She called the project Changing New York. Abbott had returned from Paris in 1929 and been stunned by the transformation of the city. Hundreds of 19th-century buildings had been demolished to make way for skyscrapers. The old and the new were crashing into each other on every block. She wanted to capture it, but for 5 years, during the worst of the Depression, she could only afford to shoot on Wednesdays. When the WPA gave her funding, she later said it was the happiest day of her life. Between 1935 and 1938, Abbott photographed the city with a heavy view camera, producing images that are now considered among the most important documentary photographs of the 20th century. She shot tenement facades on the Lower East Side. She shot the Manhattan Bridge framed by crumbling warehouses. She shot pushcart vendors and skyscraper construction crews and the jagged geometry of fire escapes. And here's the detail that pins the whole era in place. Many of the buildings she photographed in 1935 no longer existed by the time her images were exhibited at the Museum of the City of New York in 1937. She was recording a city that was demolishing itself faster than she could press the shutter. One of those vanishing places was 97 Orchard Street on the Lower East Side. It was a 6-story brick tenement that had been built in 1863, and over the course of 72 years, roughly 7,000 immigrants from more than 20 countries had passed through its cramped apartments. Families from Ireland, Germany, Eastern Europe, Italy, crammed into rooms so small that people slept on orange crates and fire escapes during the summer. In 1935, the building was condemned. The landlord couldn't afford the structural upgrades required by the city's evolving housing codes. But instead of tearing it down, he simply sealed the upper floors, boarded the windows, and left the ground floor storefronts open. The apartments upstairs were locked shut, frozen exactly as they were. They stayed that way for decades. And today, that sealed building is the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, one of the most visited historical sites in New York. You can walk through those apartments and stand in rooms where immigrant families lived during the Depression. The building survived because nobody thought it was worth the trouble of destroying, and that accidental preservation gave us something rare, a time capsule of exactly what daily life looked like in 1935. Meanwhile, beneath the streets, another world was humming. In 1935, New York had not one subway system but 3, the privately owned IRT and BMT, and the new city-built IND, which had opened its first line just 3 years earlier. All 3 charged the same fare, 5 cents. The nickel fare was political gospel in Depression-era New York. In a city where a loaf of bread cost 7 cents, the ability to travel anywhere underground for a nickel wasn't a convenience. It was a lifeline. Even the outer borough of Staten Island, connected to the rest of the city by ferry, ran on the same logic. Movement was sacred when everything else had stopped. For workers chasing rumors of employment in another borough, for families visiting relatives across the city, for anyone who needed to move and couldn't afford a taxi or a trolley, the subway was the great equalizer. You dropped your nickel in the turnstile and sat on a wicker seat in a car with no air conditioning, just ceiling fans pushing the heavy summer air around, and you rode from the Bronx to Brooklyn for the same price a stick of gum cost on the street above. The subway connected the boroughs in a way that nothing else could. And in 1935, it was carrying more passengers per day than it would again for decades. The city was broke, but it was moving. That is the paradox of New York in 1935. The breadlines and the bridges, the sealed tenements and the gleaming playgrounds. The mayor, who fought the mob at dawn but buried the truth about racism at dusk. The photographer paid by the government to document buildings that were being torn down by the government. The subway that cost a nickel and carried 1 million broken hearts a day. It wasn't a city waiting for better times. It was a city in the act of becoming something, violently, unevenly, with cement dust in its teeth and hunger in its stomach. And if you look carefully at the New York that exists today, at its bridges and its parks, at its fault lines and its inequalities, at the neighborhoods that were built up and the ones that were left behind, you are still looking at decisions that were made in 1935. The concrete remembers, even when we forget.